Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it's time for another discography ranking. Today we will be ranking the studio albums of the Queen of American folk music, Joan Baez. Joan Chandos Baez, born the 9th of January 1941 in New York City, New York. The daughter of a Mexican father and a Scottish mother, Baez moved around frequently during her childhood before eventually settling on the West Coast, where she became absorbed in social justice advocacy and in the protest music scene. Baez's own vision of and her own perspective on social justice came from her experience facing harassment as a Mexican woman, as well as her experience living in foreign countries and communicating with people from many walks of life. When Baez moved to Boston in 1958, she met several prominent figures in the East Coast folk world, including Odetta, whose influence is evident in Baez's music from the very beginning, and Bob Gibson, at the time one of folk music's most popular live performers. Gibson invited Baez to perform as a guest of his at the inaugural Newport Folk Festival, a folk-centric offshoot of the Newport Jazz Festival. Baez agreed, and her performance at the festival was met with extreme acclaim. After having been more or less a complete unknown, despite performing at various New York City clubs and things like that, Baez had become one of folk music's most prominent female performers almost overnight, and within months she had signed to Vanguard Records, eventually releasing her debut studio album with them in July 1960. Over the next few years, Baez's star continued to grow. She toured extremely consistently and was a very popular live act. She appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1962, and her records were consistently Vanguard's best sellers. Even her younger sister, Mimi, received a contract with Vanguard eventually, along with her husband, Richard Farina. During this time, Baez had started developing a friendship with a New York singer-songwriter who, in 1963, was on the cusp of releasing what would become his breakthrough second album. You may have heard of him. The role that Joan Baez played in the breakout of Bob Dylan can't really be overstated. She started playing covers of his music at her popular concerts, and the two made multiple prominent live appearances together in 1963, including at the Monterey Folk Festival, the Newport Folk Festival, and the March on Washington. Baez admired Dylan's ability to take topics related to politics and social inequity and distill them into a contemporary new sound, and she gravitated towards him strongly as a potential new leader of the American folk movement. The two began a romantic relationship during this time as well. However, if you watched my Dylan discography ranking video from a few months ago, or if you know anything about the man in general, you're aware that very quickly he grew uneasy with his status as the leader of a movement, as it were, and his music began shifting away from folk sounds towards more electric textures and free-form abstract lyrics. These changes in Dylan's perspective and in his life were too much for their personal relationship to overcome, and the two of them separated in or around 1965, although Baez continued to perform his songs in concert consistently afterwards. Baez's music was also evolving during this period. She began a series of classical-influenced records working with Peter Schickele, who you might know better as the humorous classical composer P.D.Q. Bach, and by the end of the decade, she had begun recording songs in Nashville. The latter move was at the behest of her then-husband, anti-war activist David Harris, who Baez had met in prison in 1967 following a demonstration. The two married the following year, and by mid-1969 were expecting their first child. But when Harris was drafted into the Vietnam War and refused on the grounds of being a conscientious objector, he was arrested and spent almost 2 years in prison. Baez appeared at the Woodstock Festival that summer, visibly pregnant, and her set, which closed the first day's performances, has been consistently marked as a highlight of that festival. After the birth of her son, Baez continued recording music in Nashville for the coming years, during this time starting to write some of her own music as well. 1971 would mark two major changes for her. She decided to leave Vanguard in favor of A&M Records, a more commercially viable record label, and she and Harris would also divorce during this time, marking the end of her first and ultimately only marriage. Baez's releases at A&M were at first so heavily political that they didn't chart well for the most part, although she remained prominent as an activist against the Vietnam War, even traveling to North Vietnam in 1972 and surviving the Christmas bombings that took place during that time. Her eventual return to commercial prominence came in the mid-70s, in part thanks to her leaning into the Laurel Canyon folk sound that had become so successful during that time, but also in part thanks to one of her own songs, Diamonds and Rust, a composition that drew immediate acclaim from critics and audiences, as well as immediate speculation that the song was about Bob Dylan. It would be years before Baez eventually confirmed that the song was about Dylan, but the speculation was rampant even then, especially given that Dylan had just released his own confessional record a few months before, Blood on the Tracks. Dylan himself loved Diamonds and Rust. He has praised it numerous times in interviews, and in the wake of the record's success, Dylan invited Baez to perform as a featured act on the Rolling Thunder Revue Tour. The tour not only cemented Baez's connection to Dylan as an artist, but it also raised her profile once again to mainstream audiences. Unfortunately, after the tour's conclusion, Baez's follow-up records did not bear the same commercial success. After leaving A&M for Portrait Records in 1977, she released only 2 albums with that label before being dropped by the end of the decade. Unable to get a studio contract, Baez's focus in the 80s would be predominantly on touring and activism, performing at a plethora of benefit concerts, most prominently featuring as the opening act of the U.S. portion of Live Aid in 1985. Baez also performed prominent concerts in Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, immediately prior to the Velvet Revolution, and on the West Bank in Palestine following the First Intifada. Performances that were certainly not without controversy, but proved her willingness to travel to places of conflict in the interest of making a statement. By the end of the decade, Baez had returned to recording studio albums with Gold Castle Records, and she would continue to release studio material sporadically across multiple different labels for the rest of her career. While initially her material attempted to stay commercially relevant and continued to include original songs written by Baez herself, eventually she started to work more consistently with Nashville musicians again and focused on recording songs written by younger songwriters, who she would also frequently take on tour with her as opening acts. This pattern continued all the way through 2018's Whistle Down the Wind, her most recent and presumably final studio album, which was followed by a farewell tour later that year. Baez has continued to make sporadic live appearances since then, even appearing at the Newport Folk Festival earlier this year, but for the most part she has continued to keep her life private. This year, of course, we also have the release of the film A Complete Unknown, and without getting into an actual review of the film, I will say that for as much as I think there are issues with it, it is a good film overall, but for as much as I have issues with certain pieces, including how Baez is portrayed and how her character is written, I think it will serve ultimately not just as an introduction to Bob Dylan for many people, but as an introduction to Joan Baez and her impact, both on Dylan's career, but also, and I think more importantly, separately from Dylan. I think one of the kind of strengths, I think, is how the film does portray Baez as a very strong individual, as a very strong and independent character. And I think there are flaws in that portrayal in the sense that maybe she's portrayed as a little bit of a seductress type, and very, very married to traditionalist ideas to the point where it feels like she's holding Dylan back. And I think there may be truth to these elements, but I think they're a little bit exaggerated at the same time, and I think it kind of does a disservice to Baez. But I think ultimately it certainly is a film that I think will cause people to be curious about Baez as a figure and as a musician. And hopefully the point of this video will be to kind of talk about her career a little bit more properly, and again, how to separate her from Dylan. You certainly can't separate their careers entirely, and obviously in my overview of her career, I've mentioned him quite a bit, but the fact is that Joan Baez was a big deal before Bob Dylan ever entered the picture, which the movie talks about, and a huge part of her legacy lives very separately from the few years in which they were involved with each other. And I hope that even if people don't necessarily get all of those impressions from the film, I hope that this video and talking about her catalog more in depth help people understand and appreciate this. And as a sidebar for the record, no issues at all with the actual acting in the film. Across the board, I think it's really strong, but especially Monica Barbaro as Joan Baez, I think she absolutely kills it. And for someone who, as far as I'm aware, is not a trained singer, I think she does as good of a job as you could hope for, and a better job maybe that you could ever hope for, at capturing both Baez's speaking voice and her singing voice. It's a really phenomenal portrayal, and frankly, I think might be the highlight of the film, even more so than Chalamet's Bob Dylan. So no negative comments at all about her performance. I think she is exceptional. My concerns are maybe more so with the way that Baez's character is written in the film. Okay, so we have a total of 25 studio albums that we are going to be talking about today. A couple of records that we will not be discussing, however. For one, 1959's Folk Singers Round Harvard Square. This is a collection of folk songs that Baez recorded with a couple of other folk singers, Ted Alavizos, a Juilliard-trained librarian who went on to release a couple of albums of Greek folk songs, and Bill Wood, who left music entirely to get his doctorate in biology and became a prominent researcher in the field of microbiology, as well as an advocate for science education. Really interesting career path, really cool guy by the sounds of it, who I am sorry to say passed away earlier this year when I was, which I found out when I was doing my research. Rest in peace. Seems like a great guy. Baez is only present on half the songs on this record, so it doesn't seem fair to count it as part of this ranking, but completists will want to hear it because it's proof of just how strong of a performer she was early on. If you like her debut record or really any of her first couple of albums, there's little reason to think you won't be enamored by her performances here as well. I'm also not going to be including the 1971 soundtrack album, Carry It On, the soundtrack to a documentary on Baez that came out at that same time. Most of these songs were included on other records, so I don't really see the point in mentioning it here as a distinct studio album. And while Baez has released a ton of live albums and I have not heard all of them, I'm going to call out a couple. 1976's From Every Stage is probably the most famous one. This was a record consisting of material she recorded on tour in the wake of Diamonds and Rust coming out. And there's no doubt it's a strong live album. The biggest complaint I have about this record is that I'm not convinced by Baez doing gospel music. That's not to say it's not sincere. It's very sincere. It's very earnest. And she definitely takes inspiration from a lot of gospel singers. But I don't think she has the voice to pull off some of the material, especially on kind of the second LP in this double LP set. It's trying to be Aretha, and I don't think that plays to her strength. She's a phenomenal singer, but she doesn't have the natural power of an Aretha or a Mahalia Jackson or what have you. But overall, it is a good album. It's well played, and it is a pretty solid overview of a lot of her most famous songs, her most famous covers and things like that. So it's worth checking out. Additionally, I have to call out her first two live albums, 1962's Joan Baez in Concert and 1963's Joan Baez in Concert Part 2. I'm just going to say it right here. If I included these in this ranking, these might be the top two albums on the ranking, and I'm not exaggerating. I think there is something special about hearing Baez in this live setting at this point in her career, because it's at this point where she stands apart from absolutely everybody. There is no one else who has the stage presence that she does, her ability to captivate an audience with just one guitar, which for the record, she plays extremely well. Her acoustic guitar playing is extremely underrated, especially given that she was self-taught. And also captivating people with her voice, which is pristine as always. I love how she engages the audience, gets them to sing along at various points. And I appreciate how you can already start hearing the content of her material changing in part 2. She's already starting to incorporate Dylan covers into her set list, and hardly any of these people know who Dylan is at this point, which is impossible to picture in this day and age, but it's the truth at that point. So yeah, I mean, I think it has the strengths of her other early material, which, as you'll see, I do think very highly of, but with the added benefit of seeing her as it were, metaphorically speaking, hearing her in a truly live setting. Check these records out. I cannot recommend them highly enough. They're absolutely essential for understanding the appeal and the impact of Joan Baez, the performer and the musician. But all right, that is my lengthy preamble over. Let's go ahead and start ranking these records. At number 25, and I'll preface this by saying that I think all of these albums are at the very least okay. There's nothing especially bad in any of these. But my number 25 is going to be 1979's Honest Lullaby. This is the second of the two releases that she did on Portrait, a CBS imprint. Baez has never spoken very positively about her time on that label. She's always said comments to the effect of that it was a mistake to leave A&M Records, and she was not a great fit at Portrait. She and the kind of executive team there didn't see eye to eye with the topics that she wanted to advocate for and write about. And the result is, I think both of those records are very compromised in a lot of ways. This is very MOR, very kind of even-keeled, very little dynamics in this. There's a heavier emphasis on piano here than on previous records. She's a good pianist as well. I don't necessarily say that as a negative, but I'm not necessarily crazy about much that's on here. The title track is nice. I like For Sasha. That's a track about, it's kind of set in like the Holocaust. I think that has moving elements to it, but I think it's all just a little bit hampered by the era that it's in. It's one of the only Baez records that I think sounds dated to the point of it being a little bit of a detriment for my personal enjoyment. And No Woman, No Cry, no thank you. I don't necessarily love the idea of her doing a rendition of that. I don't think it sounds supernatural. It's fine. It's not offensive. You can put it on and I think be totally totally chill with the music that you're listening to. But I think Baez is a very interesting artist, a more interesting artist than people give her credit for. And I think this is one of the only records she puts out where I truly don't think there's a whole lot of anything to write home about. So it's my bottom. Not great. Number 24, I have 1968's Baptism, A Journey Through Our Time. A hard record to talk about. This is one of the 3 albums that she did with Peter Schickele, like I mentioned earlier. And this is entirely, or mostly, a record of Baez reciting poetry above these kind of orchestral arrangements. So there's still some musical moments. There are still moments where she does sing on here, but for a lot of this is poetry. And it's poetry for the most part from names that you would kind of expect. You have Walt Whitman, James Joyce, William Blake, kind of major figures like that. Federico Garcia Lorca. And on the one hand, it's interesting, and I almost want to respect this project's ambition because it is very different from what she was doing in the past. But on the other hand, I have a hard time saying it's all that ambitious in the first place. Spoken word records are not necessarily as left field as one might think. It's this record in particular, I think, is very matter of fact in how it's executed. And I think Baez, as a reciter of poetry, again, she has a great just voice in general. She has an excellent speaking voice, and I think she's a very calming reciter, just maybe not transcendent. And again, I think when you are comparing this to the other records she does, because there's nothing else in here that really compares closely to this, it becomes hard for me to properly evaluate this compared to kind of her other material. It's nice for what it is, but it's not a project that I have a ton of desire to ever put on and spin, certainly on a regular basis. I don't think it's the complete misfire that some people think it is. I think it has its place, but this was never going to compare very highly to most of her other material for me. So Baptism will come in at number 24. Number 23, I have 1977's Blowin' Away. Let's start with the bad on this record. So this is the first of her two Portrait Records releases. Starting with the bad, terrible album cover, worst of the bunch. I don't know, like, it's meant to be silly, it's meant to be funny, but that's not her image. Joan Baez has never been marketed or advertised as a silly and goofy person, so I really don't know what the point is. This cover sticks out like a sore thumb. And then we have the song Time Rag. This track is meant to be a critique of a Time magazine interview she did, and in that sense, like, it would be fine, but the track, the style of the track is what holds me back. It's this vaguely funky jam where the verses that Baez is performing here are just kind of straight up rapping in the late 70s, and no, I'm sorry. I don't like it. I don't like it very much. I think it's a little bit too analogous to what Joni Mitchell was doing in the later part of the 70s, which I'm also not overly crazy about for various different reasons. So those two are pretty major black marks, and I would say probably that Time Rag is her worst song if I had to pick one. I think the rest of the record ultimately is fine. I think compared to the record before it, Gulf Winds, the arrangements here are even louder than they were in the past. So very similar kind of like late 70s, like light FM, MOR, Laurel Canyon adjacent stuff. But now, as opposed to Gulf Winds, which, as we'll talk about, is entirely an album of originals, this is again a mixture of originals and covers. And again, there's some nice tunes. I like the track Sailing on here. I think Luba the Baroness is interesting. But again, in terms of the rest of her catalog, I think this is a little bit anonymous. I think the problems that I have with it, specifically the one song, do tend to drag this one down pretty hard. And it's another record where I would say it's fine if you have to listen to it. It's not offensively bad by any means, but it just kind of exists. And thankfully, we're going to get a lot more positive really quickly here. But these first three Baez records are probably the ones that I think are the most anonymous and that I had the least to say about. So Blowin' Away comes in at number 23. Number 22, I have 1973's Where Are You Now, My Son? This is a very difficult record to talk about. It's a very strange album. The first half of the record is entirely conventional. It's a continuation of the protest-specific kind of singer-songwriter fare that she did on her previous record and that she had been doing in a while. And there's several good tracks on here. I especially like the songs Rider Pass By and Windrose. But then you get to the second half. The second half is this kind of amalgamation of spoken word recitation with these field recordings from when Baez visited North Vietnam over Christmas 1972, which I mentioned in the intro. So they include snippets of conversations that are being had and then observations as well after various bombings of Hanoi. And so that kind of mixture of the field recording elements, the spoken word recitations, and then there's also some kind of like sung quote unquote chorus bits as well. In the second half, when it's all combined into one track as well, it's the title track. It's very bizarre. And in a way, it is one of the most ambitious things I think she has ever done. The comparison that this brings up to me, which sounds totally absurd, but I think there's a parallel to be drawn, is the post-rock efforts of bands like Godspeed You Black Emperor. They just put out a record earlier in 2024, of course, pertaining to the Palestinian genocide. And I think that element of using kind of, using field recordings, which Godspeed doesn't really use on that record, but in previous records, field recordings and then musical textures to convey these horrors and these ideas. Like, I think there's overlap there, and I think there's a lot of risk. Like, Baez took a lot of risk in doing that, and I respect that a hell of a lot. But I would be lying if I said that I think this has anywhere near the same impact as like a Godspeed record would. I do think that the tonal shifts between the studio bits and the field recordings are pretty stark. And again, considering that this is only one half of the album and the second half is again pretty like conventional material, it just kind of ends up leaving the track and the record sticking out like a sore thumb in her catalog. So I respect this album a lot, and in my heart of hearts, I would love to say that this holds up better in a ranking and would have kind of a higher position. And if you're someone who is interested in that sort of like wild kind of left field ambition, give it a try. Because again, like I said, it's about as unique of a musical decision as Baez makes on any of these recordings. But I think a lot of people are going to be turned off by it, turned off by the approach, and turned off by the idea here. And I can't necessarily blame them for it. It's not an easy record to recommend, and certainly not one I would recommend starting Baez's discography with by any means. Number 21, I have 1989's Speaking of Dreams, the second of the two Gold Castle records. This is kind of a strange selection of tracks here. You have, as is kind of typical, a bunch of traditional songs on this record mixed with a few Baez originals, some folk tunes, and then you also have a George Michael song on here, the song Hand to Mouth, which is an album track off of his debut record, Faith. Kind of an odd decision. It sticks out in that way, even though the lyrical content makes it obvious why Baez would have picked it, and it's not a bad cover. But definitely, I think one of the more kind of interesting and strange track listings of any Baez record. I think the production, I have kind of critiques with the production on both of the late 80s Baez records, the comeback records, as it were, where I think they are probably the last moments where Baez is trying to cling to a very clearly commercial sound. And I don't think it sounds bad, but I think it doesn't necessarily play to her strengths per se. The title track on this record is kind of bizarre, a romantic anthem from Baez to a young lover in Paris who, according to her, was not even born yet when her career started. So kind of an interesting lyrical premise there. As I mentioned, she'd been never married after her marriage with David Harris, although she had several kind of on and off relationships, including with Steve Jobs, randomly enough. Jobs is not the person she's talking about here, but I think that's one of those weird little career, like one of those little biographical detours that's very interesting, that Baez and Jobs were a thing for a while. So kind of a bizarre track. There are a couple of nice duets here. I do like the duet with Jackson Browne on the song El Salvador, and the Paul Simon duet on Rambler, Gambler, and Whispering Bells is kind of fun. Simons does a lot of like the backing vocals on that one. Little bit kind of like post Graceland aesthetic there. But overall, you know, it's a fine album. It's not a career highlight, as I say. But I don't think that the qualms that I have with it, which is kind of the oddball song selection in the production, I don't think they necessarily get in the way too much. I think it's a perfectly fine album. And yeah, Speaking of Dreams comes in at number 21. Number 20, and I'm going to pause here by saying that I don't necessarily know how quote-unquote conventional of a ranking this is going to be. So I'll emphasize my point by saying that I think a lot of these records, especially once we get to like the top 15, are on a very similar playing field, and these rankings could shuffle all over the place. But I feel like this record is one that probably would be a lot higher on a lot of people's lists, which is fine. My number 20 is going to be 1966's Noel. So this is Baez's Christmas record, and this is the moment where she first really starts to pivot into kind of classical arrangements. This is the first of her kind of 3-record stretch with Peter Schickele. And I do like the arrangements in a way here. There's a very kind of 18th century classical feel with how these songs are arranged. There's a very heavy usage of woodwinds and strings. I don't think it's transcendent, and it's definitely imitation. But I think it is a very nice sound. And I think the song selection here is very... it would be typical, except for I think how the songs play with the arrangements. I think the arrangements cast a bit of a darker shadow on these tracks and make this a little bit more of a haunting Christmas record than one might expect. So I kind of like that piece. I think my issue with the album, in the sense of why I don't put it higher, is that I don't think it plays to her strengths as a vocalist. There are moments during this kind of mid-60s phase where Baez is really pushed to enhance the operatic side of her singing. And there's no doubt that her voice has a classical bent to it, as far as how piercing and how bright her soprano and her vibrato is. But I think here it kind of tries to stretch her more operatic tones to a point where I don't think she has the natural power in her voice to support it. And I think that's where I struggle a little bit, which could just be a me thing. But there is an ambition with this record, and I appreciate that ambition compared to the records that she had before, and I admire that. And so I would say, from this point, I think these are albums that I would confidently say that I would recommend. Just understand that I think if you were to start with this record, especially given the time of year that we're in right now, recording this video just after Christmas, just understand that this might be a fine album to start with, but this is very atypical for her sound. So for me, Noel comes in at number 20. Number 19, I have 1987's Recently. This is her comeback record of sorts after an 8-year hiatus from releasing studio material. Her first release on Gold Castle. Solid album, and I think it opens extremely strongly. I really like her rendition of Brothers in Arms here. Some great kind of synth bass on that track. And Baez's voice, we're starting to hear her kind of drop into her kind of middle-aged, more kind of alto sounds here. And yeah, I mean, her voice, as we will come to find out, I think her voice aged like wine for the most part, aged superbly. I also really like the track Asim Bonanga, very strong for its time, Grammy-nominated song as well, an anti-apartheid track, some really stunning backing vocals on that song. And yeah, again, this record is still very much an album that is leaning into contemporary tones. So it is arguably the most 80s sounding Baez record, that one and Speaking of Dreams. And again, I'm not as bothered by the production on this record maybe as much. And I do think that compared to Speaking of Dreams, the song selection is a little bit stronger. I will say there is one moment in the middle that I'm not super crazy about. It's the kind of medley Let Us Break Bread Together and Oh Freedom. This is a live recording that's kind of dropped into the middle of everything here. And again, when I talked about Baez's kind of gospel singing in my discussion of her live records earlier, this kind of fits into kind of the same vein. And because it's a live song, it just kind of throws the whole flow of the record off. And so then the album kind of has to catch back up with itself at the end to get you back into that headspace. I think if you would replace that with a studio recording of something else, I think the record might have improved its position in the rankings by a few places potentially. But again, if 80s production bothers you, this might not be the Baez record to start with, or might not be one to prioritize, but I think there are a lot of really strong interpretations here, and this is a really solid entry point into Baez's kind of middle-aged career, and what would become, again, as you're going to find out, a career renaissance for her, as far as I'm concerned. So, solid album. It only comes in at number 19, but Recently's good, so check it out. At number 18, I have 1972's Come From the Shadows. This is her first record to be released with A&M. And even though I said during that part of the description that A&M was, it's a larger label than Vanguard was, the idea was to try to boost her commercial viability, especially coming off of Baez having her biggest commercial hit with The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. This is not a very commercial record. There's a lot of songs here with extremely strong socially conscious themes. The song To Bobby is on this track, and this is, calling it the precursor to Diamonds and Rust is kind of weird because it's the only other song Baez wrote about Dylan, and this one takes a very different tone. It's it's a song that is meant to kind of chastise Dylan a little bit, kind of criticizing him for leaving the protest music scene and almost pleading with him to come back, basically saying, we need you now more than ever. You've abandoned us, type of thing. It's a good song. It's understandable why this one has not necessarily aged as well as Diamonds and Rust has. And again, it kind of really sits and really emphasizes where Baez was kind of in her career at this point and kind of what her focus was, still very ingrained in that protest music environment. I don't adore the song selection compared to her previous records. Songs like Rainbow Road, I wasn't crazy about that one. It feels like kind of lesser material compared to tracks that she was covering on her previous albums. And I think the originals on here, songs like To Bobby, All the Weary Mothers of the Earth, even Song of Bangladesh, which I do still kind of like, but I feel like there's some occasionally kind of clunky wordplay at times. I think Joan Baez is a very underrated songwriter, and you will see evidence of that the further we go on in this list. But admittedly, there are points where I think she fits words to music in a very, very clear and obvious way, as opposed to letting the music shape the words. And that results in some kind of either odd wordplay or odd kind of syllabic structure. And this record, I think, is a little bit more guilty of that than others are. But I do really like, again, some of the renditions here. I like Tumbleweed. I think the rendition of Imagine at the end here is nice. Again, avoiding kind of, we're well before the era when covering Imagine was a huge cliche. So I think it's a good send off for the record. So yeah, it's an enjoyable album. It definitely has its place. I know there are some people who think more highly of this record than I do. It only comes in at number 18, but I think at this point, again, we are getting to the point where a lot of these are interchangeable. And I think the strengths of some of these other records appeal to me a little bit more than this one does. So Come From the Shadows comes in at number 18. Number 17, I have 2008's Day After Tomorrow. So this is the first record I have talked about so far that was released after the 1980s. She has released a number of albums in the 90s, 2000s, and into the 2010s. The fact that this is the first record that I have talked about from this era should probably tell you something about how strong I think this era is. And I think a lot of these records are criminally underrated and extremely strong. Day After Tomorrow, so this is a Steve Earle produced record, produced by the great Steve Earle. She had worked with him, recorded one of his songs on her previous record, and he's all over this place. He has a strong presence as a backing vocalist here. He has a couple of songs on this record that Baez records, and it's a really nice sounding album. Now, I will say, at this point, Baez is well into her mid to late 60s. This is probably the most muted her voice has sounded up to this point, and that's not a bad thing, but it does render this record as more of a Twilight Years album, I think. This is where we are talking about a singer whose voice is kind of in their old age. And because of that, I think this record has an intimacy, and with that, maybe a lack of dynamics compared to these other late career albums. And that's why I think it ranks a little bit lower for me than some of the others. Still a lot of strong tunes. I like the Earl tracks on here. Scarlet Tide has a very nice traditional folk vibe. The title track is a Tom Waits cover. She does a couple of these kind of in her last few albums. It's possibly my favorite thing here. It's a really pleasant record, and really short as well, a really efficient length. So, you cannot go wrong, I think, with any of these Baez records from the 90s and onwards. And even if this is maybe one of the least remarkable ones to my ears personally, it's still very enjoyable. It's extremely pleasant and graceful in a lot of ways. And Steve Earle fans should check this one out as well. Well worth your time. Day After Tomorrow, number 17. Number 16, I have 1967's Joan. This is the last of the kind of classical records that I'll be talking about here. And this one is really starting to pivot into kind of the more orchestrated, like orchestral pop of the late 60s. It is very much, I think, the most commercial centric, the most commercially oriented record that Baez had put out to this time. In the sense that there are more covers of kind of, at the time, commercially viable songwriters than there were in the past. She does a Beatles cover on here, Eleanor Rigby. There's a Donovan cover on here, a couple of them actually. Simon and Garfunkel's Dangling Conversation, Tim Hardin's on here. Just kind of a lot of these really kind of popular songwriters that Baez is then reinterpreting with these very kind of Baroque classical instrumentation and orchestration. Having said all that, I think, a lot of this is very good. And definitely, I think, is setting the stage for what Baez will do in future albums, even though her future records will take more of a country tilt than anything else. But I think a lot of it is very pleasant and strong in that way. But I have to point out one song in particular, which is the song Children of Darkness. This is a cover of Richard Farina, who I mentioned at the start. Richard Farina married Baez's sister Mimi, and Richard and Mimi had a successful career for a few years as a duo act in the folk music scene, also for Vanguard. And Richard Farina died in a car accident around the time of this record coming out. And for Baez, who I think had been at the time intending to work on a full-length record with Richard, it was a very powerful moment. And so Children of Darkness, which is a Farina song, is a really effective and I think moving tribute to him. One of the best mergings of vocals and arrangements that I think she has put onto an album at this point. A clear highlight for me on this album. Also, I'll shout out, there are a couple of songs on here, North and Saigon Bride, where Baez gets writer's credits on there. These are not, again, she gets writing credit. She didn't write the full song. These kind of full self-written songs will come a little bit later, again, after she's immersed herself in the Nashville scene. But it's one thing to point out. I don't think Joan is a remarkable achievement necessarily in the grand scope of her career, in the sense that I don't think it outshines a lot of the other albums, but I do think it serves as a major stepping stone for what is to come afterwards. And I think you hear the seeds of a lot of the artist that Baez will become in this record. And that alone, I think, makes it very valuable. So Joan comes in at number 16. It's a strong album. I would recommend it. Number 15 could be one of the more contentious picks on the list, potentially, because I know a lot of people think extremely highly of this record. Again, at this point, it's all very kind of even-keeled in similar tiers for me, so just bear that in mind. My number 15 is 1971's Blessed Are. This is the final record that Baez put out with Vanguard. It is a double record, and it captures her at this period where she is very, I think, creatively motivated. She at this point is just starting to really get comfortable writing songs. And so because of this, about a third to half the songs on this record are Baez's own tunes, which is really cool. And I think to this record's credit, I think it starts amazingly strong. I think the title track is one of her best early tunes, really beautiful song. And then it is immediately followed with The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, which was her biggest hit ever as a solo artist. It hit, I believe, number 3 on the singles charts. And it's a good rendition of the band's song. Again, maybe not a song that you would peg Baez for doing an effective cover of necessarily, but I think it gallops along at a nice clip. And I think it's easy to tell how this one had that level of crossover commercial success in a way that a lot of her other singles didn't. It feels a little bit kind of like Spirit in the Sky-esque, I suppose, is how I would describe the kind of arrangement of that piece. Now, part of why I don't think Blessed Are works quite as well for me is just because I think there are a lot of songs on this record that kind of have that instrumental style, where there's a lot of kind of like vocal choruses and things like that. And it maybe doesn't have as many of the intimate moments that some of her previous records did. There are a couple of things that I'm not super crazy about. For instance, again, kind of a consistent thing. I don't love the gospel attempt on the song Put Your Hand in the Hand. But all in all, and I also don't think the length of this record necessarily helps. It is a bit of it is a lot to sit through at about 75 minutes or so. But I do think that, it's an important mark. It's an important watermark in kind of Baez's development again, because even if I don't think that the songwriting here is as strong as what she will do on future albums, I do think that it shows herself at least experimenting and trying new things. And I think when her songwriting does kind of hit that comfort zone, it will eventually really start to shine. But again, a lot of like strong tracks on here, both originals and covers. I think the Mickey Newbury covers on here are pretty consistently successful, like Angeline, like the 33rd of August. It's just, yeah, it's a lot. And I think other records of hers around that time period do a little bit more with less, for me personally. So Blessed Are comes in at number 15, but it's a good album, and a very good album even, and it's worth checking out. Number 14, I have 1964's Joan Baez 5. Compared to her first two records, this is number 3 for her. There's a much heavier influence of contemporary material on this record. You still have kind of traditional pieces like The Death of Queen Jane and The Unquiet Grave, but you also have more renditions of Dylan songs. So It Ain't Me, Babe, for instance, this is her first studio recording of a Dylan song on here. You also have Phil Oakes and Johnny Cash both mentioned on here. And I think those renditions are really strong. I think what maybe puts it down a little bit for me is that, again, we're now at this period of time where I think her first two records are much more, no pun intended, they're much more kind of on the cultural vanguard. They're much more like trying to capture something that is truly unique. And at this point, this is the first record where Baez sounds a little bit like she's trying to kind of not come from behind, but match up with what some of her peers are doing. And I think that causes this record to sound a little bit less distinct and unique in that way. But that doesn't take away from the performances. There's also a predecessor here to what will eventually form her more kind of classical records towards the middle part of the decade. The Villalobos aria Bachianas Brasileiras, number 5. Very, very popular classical aria. Again, your mileage may vary as far as like how well you think Baez performs that style of music, and it's unquestionably a huge detour compared to everything else that she's basically ever recorded at this point, but it does prove her strengths as a vocalist. I think this one in particular does a little bit of a better job playing to her strengths than maybe some of the arrangements in like Noel, for instance. So overall, it's consistently strong and has a lot of the same strengths as her earliest studio material. Again, we're just in a very kind of tightly packed group of records here. So Joan Baez 5, it'll come in at number 14. Number 13, I have 1969's David's album. This is a kind of a parallel project to Any Day Now, the Bob Dylan covers record that she did around this time period. It was recorded during the same sessions, and because of that, it leans into the same country influences of that record. This is Baez's kind of first exposure collectively into this environment, into the environment that is Nashville studio musicians and the Nashville sound, if you will. And I think it's undeniable, personally, that her work with these Nashville musicians is consistently like career highlight stuff. It's consistently, I think, the best playing on any Baez record. And you have so many great musicians: Grady Martin, Pete Drake, Jerry Reed, Pig Robbins, Kenny Buttrey, just all over this place, and really elevating this material. And Baez, I think, can match all of them step for step with how she interprets these songs vocally. Now, I think it's easy to maybe see David's album as kind of being a secondary project to the Dylan covers album, and maybe in a way it is. But on the other side of the coin, I suppose, is that, you know, this was in many ways a dedication to her husband, who was a big country music fan and at the time was imprisoned for his resistance to the draft. And I think the performances here, even if I don't love the record as a whole as much as the Dylan covers album, I still think there are a lot of interesting songs. I really, really like Green Green Grass of Home, excuse me. Poor Wayfaring Stranger is a duet with Baez's sister, Mimi. I think the two of their voices work really well together. Hickory Wind, Graham Parsons cover, I think that's really great. And the song Glad Bluebird of Happiness, I don't know the original version of that song. It's a Daryl Scrabak song. I hope I pronounced that name right. But the meter changes on this song, I think, are really interesting, and how it kind of moves back and forth from quadruple to triple meter and that sort of thing. Very interesting album. It maybe gets lost in the shuffle compared to some of Baez's other Nashville and country influenced records, but I think it's worth checking out on its own as a standalone piece. Very strong. Highly recommend, as I do with all these other records here. David's album comes in at number 13. Number 12, I have 1965's Farewell Angelina. Let's start off by talking about the title track. It's one of her most popular songs, I would say, even featured in the film A Complete Unknown. Another Bob Dylan affair, this time an unreleased one, and it's a stunning track. A stunning, stunning song. And I love how Baez handles it, because I think in her hands, the relationship between kind of the narrator in the song and Angelina takes on a real gray area. I think in the hands of Dylan, it would have been easy to interpret as a purely romantic interest or a romantic relationship. But in this case, the desperation here could very well be a romantic one, could very well be a platonic one. We don't know. There's a gray area in how Baez sings the song, and I think that's super important to talk about. And then you follow that up immediately with a rendition of Mama, You've Been on My Mind, but with the gender's reversed, so it becomes Daddy, You've Been on My Mind. So again, I think that little distinction, these little choices like that, speak to the conscience and the intention with how Baez makes decisions as far as how to cover these songs. Not just Dylan songs, but these tracks in general. Again, another really strong record. You're starting to hear electric influences come into Baez's music. Again, differing from the portrayal that you see in the Complete Unknown film. Like, she is also trying to use electric influences, even if obviously it's not getting into bluesy territory the way that Dylan stuff was. Bob gets 4 different songs covered on the proper record, and I think all the renditions are really great. You also have your fair share of usual traditional songs, some other contemporary music. Donovan is covered again. A Satisfied Mind, I really like her rendition of that track. And then there's a German rendition of Where Have All the Flowers Gone, aka Sagt mir, wo die Blumen sind, to pull on my high school German for a second there. It's a strong record. It's a very strong album, and I think fans of Baez's early folk music, I think you could probably easily see people say that this is a career highlight for her, and I would not disagree with you one bit. I think this is a testament to what Baez's role is in that scene. Certainly not quite the leader of the scene in the way that Dylan was, per se, at this point, but absolutely trying to keep pace and doing a very good job of it at trying to keep up with kind of the very rapid developments inside of that folk music scene. So Farewell Angelina only comes in at number 12 on this list, but again, I think it's a really strong album, and I think, it also signifies kind of the end of that first period of Baez's career, because her next records are going to be wildly different stylistically, leaning into those classical influences more. And yeah, for what it represents, I think Farewell Angelina is a strong record, and one that I could easily see growing on my ranking as time goes on. Number 11, a record that I really wanted to get higher, but I kind of had to cap it off here because there's just too many strong albums at this point. I have 2003's Dark Chords on a Big Guitar. So, starting in kind of the late 90s, like I said in the intro, Baez starts to kind of pivot away entirely from writing original material, and her focus becomes on recording music of kind of younger songwriters, of Gen X and I guess older millennial songwriters as well. And as you are probably noticing, I think a lot of those albums are some of the most captivating material she ever did. Dark Chords on a Big Guitar very much falls in line with that. There's a lot of covers of songwriters that were kind of up and coming during that time. Ryan Adams, for instance, this is around the time that Adams is starting to get kind of major exposure. He gets a song on this list. Jillian Welch, Natalie Merchant, Josh Ritter, and then Steve Earle, who I mentioned earlier on the closing track, Christmas in Washington. The textures of this record are what interest me the most. For those of you who are fans of the record Wrecking Ball by Emmylou Harris, I think this is the closest Baez has gotten to matching the kind of Lanois-inspired production that's on that record. It's very grimy, it's very rootsy, probably the most clearly like alt country, as it were, that any of her albums have ever sounded like. Very strong, like electric guitar sounds here. Certainly as heavy of a record as she ever put out. And that's really cool, and that's really interesting. I think maybe does it sound the most natural for her voice, especially given, that period of her career? I don't know. But I think it gets a lot of points for bravery, I suppose, and ambition and dynamics. I love the ambition of this idea. I love how it sounds. I will say, compared to the record before it, I might like the cover choices a little bit less, just in the sense that I don't think the songs are maybe ones that I connect to quite as strongly. But there's still a lot of strong ones. I really like Caleb Meyer. I like Wings, and then Elvis Presley Blues. So yeah, both of the Jillian Welch and David Rawlings songs I really love. I think are clear highlights. And I think the arrangements on this record elevate even the ones that I'm not necessarily as crazy about, relatively speaking. So yeah, really strong album. One that goes under the radar. Annoying that it's the only Baez record that's not on streaming services as of my recording this video. So you have to find it on YouTube. It's very easily accessible there. But this is a record that I think deserves better. It's quite underrated. It's one of the most ambitious late career things that she's done, certainly. And I think for people who maybe are less enthralled with the Baez image, as it were, the image of someone who is very kind of like pristine and proper and has this like soprano voice or whatever, and views her as someone who does not have edge, I invite you to listen to this record, because I think you will be surprised. Dark Chords on a Big Guitar just barely misses out of my top 10, but it's a really strong album that I highly recommend. All right, we are in the top 10, and it's become kind of a bloodbath here, so I mean, it's all tight. It's all razor tight, and all these rankings could change at any given time. It took me so fucking long to finalize these rankings, you have no idea. Anyways, number 10, I have 1974's Gracias a la Vida, Here's to Life. So, after her first couple of records on A&M, which were, again, very protest-centric, Baez keeps that protest-centric idea, but gives it a little bit of a different twist. This entire record is a collection of songs from Latin America and from Spain, as well as a couple of Spanish-language originals that Baez herself wrote. Baez has said that this record was inspired following the 1973 coup d'etat in Chile that overthrew the country's democratic government and resulted in the death of numerous activists, including the singer-songwriter Victor Jara. This is by far the most that we get to hear Baez explore this side of her musical heritage, or really any of these styles. There are, again, isolated moments, I think, on other records, but this is the most that we really get to hear Baez explore her Mexican and her like Latina heritage. And not that I should have to tell you this, but none of this by any means feels like cultural cosplay. This does not feel like someone who is very far removed from that heritage trying to pay tribute and not necessarily stick the landing. It all feels very natural. Baez feels very at home with a lot of these kind of renditions. So a lot of these are going to be kind of traditional tracks, traditional Spanish tracks. There's also the song El Rossinyol, which is a traditional Catalan song. That track I think is really excellent. I think the Baez originals on here are really good. I like Las Madres Cansadas. The song Dida is interesting to point out, as it features Joni Mitchell singing on that in a wordless duet with Joan. They would go on to record the song again. I think it's a separate recording, if memory serves, on the Diamonds and Rust record. And yeah, I think, again, it's a unique kind of pit stop in the Baez career arc, but one that feels essential, one that feels like an important statement if you want to understand kind of her roots. And in doing that, kind of understanding where her passion for these social justice causes comes from. And in that sense, it's a very enjoyable record. It's a very fun record. It was, I think, the most successful record she had put out on A&M to that point. It got a lot of attention in Latin America. And yeah, I think it's well worth your time, well worth checking out, and very accessible even to those folks who maybe don't have as much experience with non-English folk music records. So Gracias a la Vida comes in at number 10. Number 9, I have 1992's Play Me Backwards. The first of her records where she kind of returns to the Nashville sound. This was released on Virgin Records, so she had left Gold Castle at that point, went to Virgin for an album. And this is also her first collaboration with producers Wally Wilson and Kenny Greenberg. And boy, I think this record serves as just such a reminder of how well she fits into that sort of country aesthetic, especially at this point in her life. She's just past age 50. She's, very much settled into her middle age, and I think this works perfectly for this sound. The record opens with the title track, another Baez original, and it's such an excellent return to form. I love the lyrics on that song. Maybe my favorite lyrics of her since the mid-70s at this point. Such a strong track. And I love, so this is the final record where there's a proper mixture of originals and covers. After this record, she kind of ditches the originals at this point. And you can, I suppose I can understand that, maybe in the sense that maybe that's like a creative spark or a lack of creative spark. She didn't feel as inspired. But man, I think the originals on here are really good. I like Play Me Backwards. I like I'm With You a lot. The Dream song, I think, is a highlight on here. I love the string quartet backing that gives me strong, like, romantic era classical vibes. It's possibly my favorite classical backing that she's ever used, if you're including the 60s records. It just sounds really nice. And I think the cover choices on here are excellent too. I love the Janis Ian cover, Amsterdam. Stones in the Road is fantastic. The Jon Stewart cover, Strange Rivers, is really good. Pair her with this sound and to get all these just great players, and it's perfect. It's the record that, for me anyways, starts this whole era of just what, again, I consider to be a late career renaissance for her. And it truly just, it sounds like an artist who is reborn, maybe not in the sense of, like, again, I'm going to compare to Dylan here, but like, this is not a time out of mind moment for Joan Baez necessarily, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily feel like an entire creative rebirth and inspiring her to write some of her best songs ever. Again, this is kind of like an endpoint for that, for her songwriting career. But I think what it does is it serves a similar role in the sense that it finds Baez on stable footing and feeling comfortable with the arc of her career and where her career has gone. And I think that speaks volumes. I think that says a lot. And I love it. I love this song, and I've loved this record, and I implore you all to check it out. And the fact that it's only number 9 tells you that we have a lot of other great albums to get to after this. So Play Me Backwards, number 9. Great stuff. Number 8, I have presumably the final Joan Baez record, 2018's Whistle Down the Wind. What an album, man. This came out 10 years after Day After Tomorrow, and you can feel the gap at that point. Baez her voice is starting to show its age, most definitely at this point. It is definitely the most kind of frail that it's ever sounded, which makes sense. She's in her late 70s at this point. But holy cow, does the entire setting of this record give her a chance to shine for, again, presumably one final time. Joe Henry on the boards for this one. He kind of played with her, I think, in some of her previous albums, produced records for Bonnie Raitt and people like that. And he knows how to put her in a position to shine. This record has this sweeping dynamism to it, this sense of dynamics that I think serve it so well. And I think that's why, to me, this record succeeds a lot more than even like A Day After Tomorrow does. I think the dynamics here really make the emotional potency of this kind of closing statement really strong. Whistle Down the Wind, the title track, another Tom Waits cover, and again, proof. She does Last Leaf on here as well. Proof to me that she could have done a Tom Waits covers album, like in her old age, and it would have been spectacular. It works just perfectly for this situation. She's covering other artists that she's covered in the past, like Josh Ritter and Mary Chapin Carpenter. I really like her rendition of The President Sang Amazing Grace by Zoe Mulford, a very kind of contemporary and relevant track. The song Silver Blade, so the kind of second Josh Ritter track that she covers on this one. I highlight this one. This is one of my favorite late career tracks she's ever done. I love the kind of haunting production of it, the minor key melody. It's just a stunning bit of recording, and her, again, kind of aging voice fits perfectly in that vibe. And when you consider that this is kind of a bookend statement to her career, and her kind of first record, one of the songs in her first record is the track Silver Dagger, hard for me not to see that little bit of a parallel and kind of see why this song maybe felt a little bit significant to her. It begins with a dagger and it ends with a blade, but both of them are silver. Really powerful album. No surprise to me why this one, and Play Me Backwards as well, which I didn't mention, was nominated for a Grammy Award. It's a really great closing statement, and it's nice to be able to talk about a defining, fantastic, moving closing statement without having the connotation of the artist being dead. It's been, at this point, almost 7 years since this record came out. Joan is still very much alive and with us, thank God, and hopefully for a lot longer to come. Yeah, it's number 8. It's a phenomenal album and a great way to send off a really respected career. Whistle Down the Wind. Check it out. Number 7 might be a bit controversial as well. I don't know. I have 1970s One Day at a Time. So this is her first record after her kind of landmark Woodstock performance had again kind of raised her public figure a little bit more. And at this point, again, she is very much engrossed in kind of the Nashville sound. So again, you have a lot of the same returning characters from the Any Day Now and David's album sessions. And this record to me is sort of, in some ways, I think it is the apex of this part of her career, because not only does it contain one of the most diverse sets of songs that she had covered up to that point, but it also merges that with a very, tight and just efficient runtime, and a focus on 2 original songs. Sweet Sir Galahad and A Song for David are the first 2 songs that she put out that were released with only her name as a songwriter, and I think they're both great. Sweetser Galahad is just a huge, huge career highlight to me. I still think one of the maybe 2 or 3 best songs she ever wrote. And I think it speaks, that track, which is very much, it's a tribute to her sister, Mimi, and the pain that she had gone through losing her husband. I think the strength of the melody writing, of the lyricism there, puts that song on the level of many of the others, of all of the others that she's covering here. And she's covering some classics like Long Black Veil, Seven Bridges Road, I Live One Day at a Time. Like, she's covering songs from very established songwriters. And I think it serves to prove the point that once you're immersed in kind of covering these songs for a while, you eventually pick up on these kind of songwriting techniques, and you begin to start understanding what makes a good song great, what makes an elite song unforgettable. And in selecting kind of from that material and selecting what are the truly great songs that I want to cover, you start picking up on that, and you start interpreting that and implementing that into your own songwriting. And I think that's where Baez deserves all the credit in the world, because I think that's very much a skill that she built for herself over a long period of time. And I think Sweetser Galahad is like a moment of, holy shit, she's here. She's a fucking legitimate songwriter on her own, in her own right. Time to take her seriously. Phenomenal song. A Song for David, I also think, is a really strong one. Again, also just really powerful, knowing the context of her personal life. And as usual, I think her actual kind of covers on here, Long Black Veil, as I mentioned, she covers a Rolling Stones song on here, No Expectations, which is pretty wild. Joe Hill became like a standard for her. She covers it in a lot of concerts after this period of time, and she does a great rendition of that. It's just consistently such a strong album, and very much, to me, like, if I'm going to pull out any Baez record from this kind of first Nashville stint, it's probably going to be this one. And even as I talk about it here, I get the sense that I've probably underrated it slightly, and I probably could bump it up a few spots in my ranking, but it is what it is. One Day at a Time comes in at number 7 for now, but it's such a strong album. Highly recommend checking it out. Number 6, I have 1968's Any Day Now, Songs of Bob Dylan. All right. For those people who are looking for examples of Joan Baez interpreting Bob Dylan, this is your place to go. This is a kind of a behemoth of a record. Again, it's another double album. And what I love about this, and why I think it is absolutely the apex of Baez interpreting Dylan, is ultimately it comes down to the song selection. The apocryphal story is that Baez picked these songs kind of at random, basically had a bunch of sheet music on the floor, picked a random song, and then they went ahead and recorded it. And maybe that's true, maybe that isn't, but I think what's evident is that these are not obvious cover choices. A lot of these songs are kind of more obscure, as it were, Dylan tracks. Granted, for officially released Dylan tracks, there's not really such a thing as a super obscure one. But songs like, Love Minus Zero, Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, even those tracks from like the classic records are One Too Many Mornings, for instance. They're not necessarily like the A-list tracks, right? And then you mix that with songs from Dylan's most recent record at the time, John Wesley Harding, like I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine, and then songs that Dylan had not released himself to that point, like Walking Down the Line, songs like Tears of Rage, I Shall Be Released, songs that people maybe had already been aware of at that point, but Dylan himself had not actually recorded. And at least in one case, the song Love Is Just a Four-Letter Word, allegedly never recorded, period. So you have this mixture of quote-unquote obscure Dylan and unreleased Dylan that Baez is giving interpretation to. And I bring it back to the record Farewell Angelina and the song Farewell Angelina, because I think that she absolutely shines in that moment when she doesn't have like an original version to compare herself to, when you're not forced to compare like her rendition of Blowin' in the Wind to Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind, when it's just her, when it's her setting the stage, and when it's her setting the bar for anything else that's to come after that, I think she really succeeds. I really like the session playing on this album, of course. Again, this is the first record that she put out with the Nashville 18 folks. Songs like Walking Down the Line, I think, are just so elevated by the guitar playing and the whole just kind of band dynamic here. They do such a strong job. And then, I think some of the interpretations that Baez does are pretty daring here. For instance, the song Tears of Rage, she does that song entirely a cappella, which is very different from the versions that you hear like the band do or on like the Basement Tapes or whatever. And I really think it's a fitting take, what Baez does, and it's a powerful one. And I think, again, that speaks to her strength in looking for unique ways to interpret these sets of lyrics. Great album. It is a lot. Again, clocking in at just over an hour, but I didn't find the length as much of a problem with this one compared to a couple of the other double albums that she's done. So Any Day Now, again, if you're looking for the Baez Dylan link, and if you're looking to see the best of both worlds, as it were, the strongest aspects of her as an interpreter of one of the best songwriters ever to live, look no further than this. Any Day Now comes in at number 6 for me. Number 5, I have 1960's self-titled debut record. Man, this thing just kind of hits you like a truck if you understand the context behind it. Again, this doesn't necessarily sound like anything else that had come out in 1960 in, I think, the best possible way. Now, I say that while also acknowledging that there are areas in which Baez, I think, is clearly pulling from other artists. For instance, I think the overall aesthetic that Baez is pulling from the most is from Odetta, in the sense that she is a solo guitar player playing these often kind of haunting ballads with a lot of oftentimes like kind of religious overtones. And you have this mixture of these kind of sparse moments with some truly amazing acoustic guitar work. What I think sets Baez apart from Odetta, and I don't necessarily mean this in a way, and I definitely don't mean this in a way to slag off Odetta, because Odetta is amazing, but I think the voice is what sets Baez apart, and what distinguishes her. And to me, it's the highlight of her material from the start. You have this really just bright, powerful soprano head voice puncturing through some of these classic folk songs like Silver Dagger, House of the Rising Sun, all these types of songs. And it really just, with all these leaps and all these like octave leaps that she's doing, it gives them a sense of urgency that's also mixed with this sort of like classical professionalism. It feels like you're left with this sort of dichotomy here where the material doesn't seem quite of this world, so it feels like ethereal. Like these are grounded like folk songs that are built from kind of, decades upon decades of being passed down orally and that sort of thing. And they're performed by this person who just feels like she's been transported from like another planet. It's a pretty wild thing to think about. All My Trials is maybe my favorite cover of hers, my favorite rendition of hers on this record. I really love that kind of minor key melodic leap at the beginning of every verse. I think that's just like chef's kiss perfect for her voice. And I think there's so many just phenomenal moments. If there's one thing to say about these early Baez records, is that they're very even keeled, right? They're very much kind of, you're getting the same type of traditional fare kind of across the board with these first two records. So they're not necessarily the most dynamic in terms of like you're expecting something different each time. You are getting 40 minutes of Baez doing these acoustic numbers. That's what you paid for. And for me anyways, it enamors me. It just blows me away. So the self-titled Baez record comes in at number 5 in my ranking, but again, we're at the point now where I think these records are truly like staggering pieces of work and well worth checking out. Would I start with this album? Hard to say. I think if you're already like attuned to this era of 60s folk music, then of course, absolutely. And it would surprise me if you haven't heard this already. But if you're someone who's maybe a bit more ingrained with like 70s aesthetics and things like that, maybe start with the 70s material and kind of work your way backwards to this. But the Joan Baez self-titled record is phenomenal, and it comes in at number 5. Number 4, I have 1961's Joan Baez Volume 2. In a lot of ways, this really is kind of the debut album, round 2, Electric Boogaloo here. But I think what puts this one a little bit over the edge for me is that I prefer the song selection a bit. It feels like Joan's voice is given the chance to be more expressive on a bunch of these tunes here, like on the song The Cherry Tree Carol, and especially that a cappella opener, Wagoner's Lad. I think that's just a phenomenal bit of recording. The Lily of the West is one of my favorite Baez recordings of any era. I think the vocal is just stunning here, just so expressive and emotional. And the guitar playing on here is positively like virtuoso stuff. I think it's just so well done. A recording that always gets me every time I hear it. The biggest sonic difference between this record and the debut is the inclusion of the Greenbrier Boys on the tracks Banks of the Ohio and Pal of Mine. It kind of helps the record sound a little bit more adjacent to the contemporary folk pop, your Kingston Trio-like performers of the day. And I think it works effectively for what it is. I don't think it necessarily jars the listener too much. I will also highlight the song Plaisir d'amour, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, The Joys of Love, which is a traditional French song that was lifted by the songwriters for the film Blue Hawaii for the track that they included in that film, Can't Help Falling in Love. So I bring that up because it's obviously a familiar melody, and it's interesting that Joan's rendition predates Elvis's by 2 months. So in a way, Joan kind of beat Elvis at his own game here. Beyond that, the strengths of this record are the exact same strengths as the debut record. I just tend to prefer the song selection a little bit more here. So not too much to add. Joan Baez Volume 2 is my number 4. And this one and the self-titled, I think, again, a lot of overlap, similarly strong records. Check both of them out one after the other. You won't be disappointed. Okay, number 3 is where I might lose everybody, because I assume most people would expect this to be the number 1 record, as it's probably most people's number 1 Joan Baez album. But for me, at least at this point, it comes in at number 3, 1975's Diamonds and Rust. We are now fully in West Coast territory here. This is the huge pivot into the Laurel Canyon sound. That sound rings loud and true on several of these songs. I hear plenty of people say, as kind of a critique of Baez in this record, that Joni Mitchell's work is a clear blueprint for this. I do agree, and I mean, Joni's even on this record at one point, but the strength to me and what keeps me from putting it down as an imitation is in how Baez keeps her own personality and her own strengths in mind still. It doesn't sound like a Joni Mitchell impersonation to me. It sounds like Baez finding her own place in that sound. I could try to be interesting and say that the title track of Diamonds and Rust isn't the best thing Joan Baez ever did. I could try to be interesting and unique and say that, but I'm not going to. I think it is the best thing that she ever did. It's a stunning piece of songwriting that stands up with just about anything released in that year or that decade. The track has these very like cutting lyrics that still hold a sort of reverence to them, which prevents them from feeling malicious. I think it's that mixture of, you know, putting Dylan down, but almost in a way that feels humorous, like making a joke out of it, so that it doesn't feel like she still holds frustration or anger towards him for how he may have treated her in the past. It sort of feels like she's looking back through sort of a lens of nostalgia. And I think the kind of keyboard sounds and things that kind of swirl around the whole track maybe give that vibe as well. It's all kind of a nostalgic haze, and we're kind of laughing about it. So these lyrics like the unwashed phenomenon or whatever, just like, to me, it almost feels like she's reading these lyrics off with a laugh. And I appreciate that. And I think Dylan saw the humor in it too, which is why he connected to it. It's a phenomenal song, and it's a great arrangement. And one would think that putting that song at the start of the album causes everything else to kind of drop off a cliff afterwards, like nothing else could compare. And maybe that's true to an extent, but I do think that her other kind of original material on here is also pretty strong for the most part. Children and All That Jazz is kind of a weird one. I think I enjoy it. It's very much kind of Baez writing this very cheery, like light FM piece with these kind of like 3-part harmony things that she's doing. Just kind of a quirky, like, again, almost funny piece, but it kind of works for me. I kind of like that. And you'll see that there's one record I have above this one that plays into that honestly a little bit more at points. So yeah, I think I like it. And I think the covers on this record are some of her best too. I love her renditions of Jackson Browne's Fountains of Sorrow. And I mentioned in the intro that Blood on the Tracks came out not too long before this. Simple Twist of Fate is given the cover treatment on this record. And I think her rendition of that is phenomenal. I think it works so well as this like ribbing of Dylan. There's one of the verses when she starts just kind of imitating his voice and his nasal accent. I think it's brilliant. I like her Stevie Wonder cover, Never Dreamed You'd Leave in Summer. The John Prine and Janice Ian covers towards the end are really solid. Yeah, it's really great. It's a great album. And I don't think having her best song ever here overshadows everything else. I think this would have been a great album even without the title track. But the title track, I think, elevates it to a point where now people remember this album. This is a record that is etched in the annals of folk pop music history. And it's well deserved. And the fact that I have 2 records currently ranked above it, 2 records that are a lot more obscure and do not get nearly the same amount of love and appreciation as this album does. On the one hand, that could be a temporary thing. A lot of these were first listens for me, and maybe I just really gravitated towards those 2 over this one, which I have heard a couple of times. But on the other hand, I think it also proves that, again, the idea that there are plenty of areas of Joan Baez's career that are very unexplored. And while I don't think Diamonds and Rust, the song, casts a shadow over the rest of the record, I do think this record maybe casts a shadow over what she did afterwards. And the 2 records that I have above this are records that she did put out after this one. And, well, let's just say that I think those 2 are especially strong. But Diamonds and Rust is number 3. It's a phenomenal album. Everything good that you've heard about it is accurate. Check it out. Okay, my number 2 record, I literally just pulled an audible kind of at the last minute here, because this was actually at number 1, but just thinking about how this music has kind of sat with me over the last couple of weeks as I've listened to it in kind of preparation for this video, and also as I've kind of recovered from illness as well, which is part of why this video was delayed. I just feel like the record that I had at number 2 actually feels closer to my number 1, and vice versa. So I'm going to make the last minute switch and talk about my current number 2 record, which is 1976's Gulf Winds. There are people who are probably throwing things at their TV screen right now, or their computer screen, or what have you, because I have this record ahead of Diamonds and Rust. It's the album that came out immediately afterwards, and almost nobody thinks that this record is as good. Most people believe that this is considered a major step down from Diamonds and Rust in a lot of different ways. Needless to say, I don't agree with that one bit. This record is definitely subject to fuller and louder arrangements than the previous records. And I understand why some people, like where that's a barrier to some people, it feels a little bit more of its time. The catch, though, is that I think the band on this record is great. Like superb for the era. And even the guitar sounds and the keyboard sounds on this record that are the most of their time are fairly restrained for the most part. I think once you get to like her portrait records later on, I think the tastefulness of everything becomes a little bit less evident. But here I still think it's kept very much within reason. The big thing about Gulf Winds is that this is the only Joan Baez record to be entirely comprised of originals. And to me, that is a significant statement for an artist who is consistently perceived as being a covers artist, as a master of interpretation, but not necessarily of songwriting. Here's a record where she wrote every damn song. And damn it if I don't think that these songs here, for the most part, are terrific. And I think, again, they lean into all these different aesthetics, whether that's the kind of sparser acoustic aesthetics, whether that's the more kind of light FM, again, Laurel Canyon adjacent material, or whether that's songs like Seabirds, which is basically just prime fucking 70s cheese with Fender Rhodes slathered all over the place, full-on yacht rock. I don't give a shit. I still really like it. I really like Caruso a lot. The opening track, Sweeter for Me, I think is really nice. Time is Passing Us By and Stephanie's Room on the second side are really terrific. And, you know, one thing I criticized a little bit about Baez's songwriting earlier in the video was that I believe that occasionally, oftentimes really, Baez comes across as a songwriter who writes words and then tries to fit the words into like the melodies. And occasionally that means that she's kind of like spitfiring words out, like to the point where it feels like there's too many syllables for the melody that she's written. Like she's saying a lot of things at once. And I think that's true of pretty much all of her songs. Even Diamonds and Rust, you could argue, has that a little bit. And, you know, I sat back and I was kind of reflecting on that mindset when I was first thinking it. And I realized that in a way, like, there are plenty of other songwriters who do the exact same thing. And one of them, I happen to think, is one of the best, you know, pop songwriters, certainly, of the last 20 years or so. That being Taylor Swift. I think that is absolutely a trademark that Taylor does on a lot of her lyrics, especially in her more recent songs, where she writes a lot of lyrics for a short span of time and then kind of rapid fires her delivery in there. And Joan does that too. And my standpoint is that, well, I think it works for one artist, so there's no reason for me to think that it doesn't work for the other. And yeah, I think her melodies are sharp. I think the actual like wordplay and the kind of analogies that Baez is using on this record are really solid, really good. But the thing is, like, this record is really good for a while, and then you get to the title track, which is the closing track. Now, the length of that track is intimidating as hell. It's 10.5 minutes. But to me, it is a prime career achievement, and in many ways, I think should be her defining statement. It's just her and her guitar on this one. Fingerpicking is great on that track, by the way. And the whole thing is her reciting a story about her childhood, which I think, based off of like how the song ends, is a response to her parents divorcing. I'm not sure about that, but either way, it's very powerful, very intimate. There's a lot of great kind of like one-liners and stuff like that about her, about the struggles that she experienced, about the joys of her childhood and how she married the two together and how she's kind of come out the other side and become the musician that she is. And again, maybe this is a song that ages the best and sits the best in the context of a discography dive like this, as opposed to, you know, listening to this record out of context without appreciating all the mini albums and career developments that she did beforehand. Maybe that's the case, but I don't know. I think it's still very potent and powerful in an isolated framing. And yeah, I think Gulf Winds is one of the best songs she ever wrote. Might even be my second favorite behind Diamonds and Rust. And this whole record is a product of its times, yes, but oh man, it's fantastic. Oh, it's so good. And yeah, I cannot recommend enough that you check it out. It's also one of the most like accessible Joan Baez records. Like, you find this in like, you know, thrift stores and used record selections like all the time, even if like there's not much of a selection to be found. I have seen used record stores where I will go to the Joan Baez section and this is the only record that's on there. There's like a bunch of copies of Gulf Winds and maybe a couple of copies of, you know, Blowing Away. So that tells you something about how accessible this record is and perhaps how misunderstood I think it is. And hopefully, if there's, you know, maybe two things that I hope that this video does. It's inspired people to check out this record, and it's inspiring people to check out my number 1 record. Gulf Winds for now comes in at number 2. Super underrated. Yeah, give it a listen. And now that brings me to my number 1, 1997's Gone from Danger. I told you at the start of this video that I thought that Baez very much had a career renaissance in the 90s and onwards. And this record is the apex of that renaissance. I kind of figured I would like the late career Baez albums a lot, but I was not expecting one to floor me as much as this album did. And some of that comes just from the fact that you look at like the amount of people talking about this record and realize that nobody talks about this album. If you look on rateyourmusic.com, for instance, this has the, of all of her studio albums, I think the only ones that have less ratings than this are the 80s ones. No one talks about this record, and it's a damn shame. So after Play Me Backwards kind of brought her back inside the Nashville scene, Baez, as I said, kind of stepped away from the writing of originals pretty much and wanted to focus her material on covers, but this time with an emphasis on singer-songwriters who were a little bit more obscure at this point. So as a result, you have songs from songwriters that, I mean, really, for the most part, like, are not anywhere close to mainstream names or household names or anything. Sinead Lohan, Betty Elders, Dar Williams, Richard Shindell, people like that. You know, notable enough names if you dig around, but not names, for instance, that I was especially familiar with, honestly. Dar Williams might have been the only one who I'd even heard of before this exercise. So you combine this intentional effort to find these songs from these kind of more, you know, these kind of nascent artists who are just kind of starting their development. Combine that focus with the Nashville session players being in full swing again here. And this was always, I think, going to be a highlight for me. Baez's voice at this point, you know, again, she's in her mid-50s at this point. So it is very much settled into this kind of mid-range alto. She doesn't have quite the high range that she used to, but instead she has this very kind of warm lower register that she's able to utilize for all of these songs. And it works so effectively. And because of that, I think, you know, especially when you combine the fact that, again, these are younger songwriters for the most part. So the emotions that they are talking about in these tracks are going to be, for the most part, emotions of younger people. Maybe not teenagers or 20-somethings, but like people in their late 20s, people in their 30s, etc. And so Baez being able to give that perspective as someone who is, you know, been around the block a little bit more and who has that kind of experience, it just frames these tracks so differently. Right away from the opening track, No Mermaid, I think you were just kind of, you know, you're sort of ready to accept what's coming, which is these songs that, again, if you're in my shoes, for instance, like I'd never heard of any of these songs before, so, you know, you're getting ready to be exposed to these very new names, these very new ideas from this person who you already trust is going to bring the absolute best out of these songs. And boy, does she ever. Now, I have to talk, you know, without, you know, I try to talk as much as I can in kind of a more neutral way about how I feel about these records without delving into my own personal, like, experiences with them and experiences listening to them. But I have to talk about my experience with this record because the first 3 songs I thought were all superb. And I thought, wow, we're on like a really, really great start to this record. I really love No Mermaid, Reunion Hill. Crack in the Mirror is really great. Again, that's getting into kind of the rootsier textures that she'll explore more on Dark Chords on Big Guitar in a few years. And then you get to the 4th track, the song February by Dar Williams, or as Baez pronounces it, February. Because again, that's kind of that pristine pronunciation that she does. She doesn't miss it even in this period of her career. Again, I'd never heard that song before. And something about hearing this got to me deeply. maybe it's the piano work. This is one of the only songs where Baez's piano is really featured. There's even a little bit of kind of a solo piece towards the end. Maybe it's the melody, which I think is absolutely gorgeous, and I think Baez knows exactly how to kind of maneuver around it and kind of change it around and sustain those notes and phrase it in an effective way. Or maybe it's the lyrics, which obviously Joan can't take credit for because it's not her song, but, you know, just hearing the expression of the song, which if you don't know is basically about a relationship that is growing cold and is literally on the ice, and ends in the middle of the song. And the way that that was portrayed and just that whole combination of everything just spoke to something very singular inside of me. It got to me. I've not had a song or a recording of a song hit me in the way to literally make me tear up and make me weepy like that has in a long time. And so and it still happens every time I put that song on, I get a little bit kind of emotional, and that is just, you know, that's the reaction, that's natural. And so after that, there was really just no coming back. The rest of the album could have been mid as hell, and I would have still given it a high rating. But the rest of the album is terrific. Fishing, I think, is great. The song Lily, this is the only one where Baez does have a writing credit on here. I think that song is really fantastic. I think Who Do You Think I Am is strong. And I think the closing track, Money for Floods, is really kind of powerful as well. It's just, it all fits into this perfect descriptor of what, if we were talking about however many other artists, you know, would be considered a perfect late career Renaissance record. And I'm not saying that there's anything preventing us from calling this the same thing for Baez. I'm just saying we don't call this a late career Renaissance record for Joan Baez because people don't know this shit exists. People don't know that this album exists. And I hope that if you've made it through all, however long this video has been at this point, I hope that you take inspiration to check this record out. It's so well worth it. And I hope that, as I have, after you've checked this record out, you're inspired to check out some of these songwriters a little bit more. I've already checked out some more Dar Williams stuff, and I really, really like her songwriting, and she's gained a new fan because of this. And this, to me, is the benefit of these types of records and the benefit of being a skilled interpreter and a skilled musician who covers songs. It's being able to have moments like this where you turn someone on to music that they were not aware of before. Being able to get the most out of a song, being able to bring a new perspective onto a song. That is what covering music and reinterpreting music is all about. And even if Joan Baez had never written a single song in her entire life, if this had just been what she had did for her entire career, that's a legacy damn worth appreciating on its own right, if you ask me. Gone from Danger is my number one. It might not stay there forever. Who knows? But at this point in time, it couldn't be anything else. All right, and we have officially hit the end of this video. I just wanted to say thank you all so much for watching through this whole video, if you did. And I really hope that you were able to get something out of this and really potentially get some curiosity into exploring Joan Baez's career. I think there's so much to appreciate here. And I think, if there's something to take away from this, it's that this perception of Baez as being a very uninteresting artist, maybe a great singer or whatever, but who was limited to interpreting songs and didn't necessarily have the artistic intrigue of a Bob Dylan or something like that. I hope people can challenge that perception a little bit more after coming away from this. I knew going in I was going to enjoy listening to her discography, but I think I still underestimated how much I was going to appreciate it and how much I was going to appreciate Baez, not just as a performer and as an interpreter of music, but as a songwriter in her own right. So please let me know, do you have a favorite Joan Baez record or song? If so, what is it? And if you're inspired to check out some of these records that I had ranked pretty highly that you've never heard before, please let me know what you think. I really hope that you like it as much as I do, or even close to as much as I do. And yeah, really well worth it. This is really a treat to do, and I hope to be able to do kind of more videos like this where we talk about artists who maybe deserve a fairer shake, or at least a different shake compared to kind of how their career has been perceived historically. And I'm really glad to have been able to do this for an artist who is still here with us, to be able to feel that kind of additional appreciation and love and support. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more discography rankings, reviews, and videos are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.